Hello, class. We are now at chapter 15 in the beginning of modern theater. And this is a period basically from about 1880 to the present. We are still, you might argue, in the era of the modern theater. And two main streams we have the realistic. We have realism, which is basically everything that resembles real life. And, this is really a sea change. In the early days, you had to put on masks, and in the Renaissance, you were still, very extravagant, and we still have some of that nowadays. But basically, they say, hey, we'll just be ourselves. We'll just be normal. How about that? We're representing life, so let's just be life. So this may seem obvious to you, but it's just part of the period and part of the period we're in. Every day on stage, situations from the lives of real people. And then there's this naturalism, which is basically like kind of a darker, grittier, type. Think of, the Batman movies or the police shows where the worlds are dark and, everybody's corrupt. And that's kind of extreme realism, but it's still realism. So we didn't have a lot of naturalism in the stage theater, but again, like it says, we see a lot of it in TV and film nowadays. Heinrich Ibsen is considered to be the father of modern drama, a Norwegian. Now, again, theater has been expanding across Europe from the four primary countries, England, France, Spain, and Italy. And now it goes up to, Russia and Norway and Denmark, and it spreads out. So Ibsen was a Norwegian, and he tackled taboo subjects. Again, playwrights are agents of social change. They see the world around them, they see what's wrong, and they dramatize it, because drama is conflict. So he was called the Great Disturber. And one of his most famous plays is The Doll's House, and I believe I have clips of that in your module, in the supplementary material. Basically, it's a story of a middle-class woman who was trying to help out her husband, and she, he was having financial troubles, and her dad had some money, and she forged his signature on a bank loan to help hubby out. Well, hubby finds out about it later on in the play, but basically she's doing this for him to save his rear. And so she's basically doing the housewife stuff, and she's, she stores money away bit by bit to pay off this loan. And, husband finds out about it and flips out, basically disowns her. And then there's a whole bunch of plot about, letters being passed and friends, weighing in on the subject. And, husband finds out eventually that it's going to be okay and wants to take her back. But guess what? She's been put through the changes, and she's had enough, and she leaves him at the end of the play. Now, this may seem like, okay, that's just a typical story, but this was like, in the 1880s, and people went to the theater, they put on their tuxes and tails, and they expected to see a story maybe about marital strife, but, it's going to end up fine, and they all live happily ever after. Well, they didn't. She ends up walking out the door and leaves her husband, leaves the children. And he goes, she goes, I need to find out more about myself. I need to educate myself. So it's a very famous play. It's really considered one of the early feminist plays about a woman finding her own life and her own voice. So again, Enemy of the People is another one of his plays. It's about a small town. The main corporation's been dumping things in the water. Of course, people are getting sick. You've heard that story before. And then he becomes an enemy of the people because he brings it up. And of course, this is a source of livelihood. So on one hand, you've got commerce, people's jobs, and on the other hand, you've got people's health. So issues like this are the things that Ibsen dramatized and brought up. And a lot of the great American playwrights copied him and looked to Ibsen as a source material. Chekhov in Russia. Chekhov was a doctor by profession. He wrote short stories, but he also wrote 4 or 5 great plays. And on the basis of those few plays, he's basically got his reputation as a great playwright. He tends to write about, you know, upper middle class, aristocratic people, um, um, and his plays are generally households full of people, and there's a lot of interaction and a lot of small detail. He's kind of like an artist who, you know, characterizes this life and these small moments in people's lives, rather than you know, some subtle, you know, idiosyncratic moments that they have, and people don't really say what they mean. They, you know, their meaning, it happens underneath. They imply things underneath, and this is also where Stanislavski comes in, because Stanislavski lived the same time and was a contemporary of Chekhov and Vankentov and other great Russian theater artists, and they were trying to find a way into Chekhov's plays. And out of that really came one of Stanislavski's basic ideas about playing the subtext, playing what you want underneath. Actions, what are your actions? Not what you're saying, but what are you doing? And the first time the Cherry Orchard played, people didn't get it. They didn't understand. But then Stanislavski's troupe and Vankentov worked together on their small theater group. They worked on it, and they worked on this life and this subtext, and they really brought out what people were trying to say. For instance, there's a marriage scene between this the lady, the housekeeper of the family, and actually she's kind of an adopted daughter. And then the guy who's the peasant who works his way up to the rank, and he basically buys the cherry orchard and there's a proposal. And you'd think in a normal play they would get married, but they're so wrapped up in their own insecurities, they stumble and bumble through it. They're like two ships missing in the night. So that kind of tragic comedy is the kind of things that Chekhov really details and does it wonderfully. Actors love to play his work. Lots of independent theater now is springing up, as opposed to the big proscenium theaters in all the major capitals. You have these small independent art theaters, and out of that becomes the future. These small theaters end up growing to be major theaters in, you know, by the time we're in the, you know, in the 1960s, 70s, and so on. Paris, Berlin, Moscow Art Theater was, again, that was the art theater that Chekhov worked in, and Stanislavski and Vankentov, and now it's the State Theater, founded the Stanislavski system. In Berlin, you had Bertolt Brecht, you know, working in his Berliner Ensemble, which is now the State Theater. And in Dublin, you had the Abbey Theater, and now that's the State Theater. So it all works out that way. And then in America, we have really the beginning of American voice. You know, in the 1800s, we had kind of the quasi-American voice. We had the sort of British, you know, style and everything. But O'Neill really voiced the American energy and ideal in the language. His father was an actor, so he came from a theatrical background, but he was a writer, and really considered the first really great writer of American theater. And his masterpiece is Long Day's Journey into Night. Here's a shot of it. It's basically autobiographical. It's about his family. That's him. He's the young one. And then his brother was an alcoholic. His mother was a morphine addict because she had complications for him in childbirth, which his brother blames him on. And then dad was a famous actor, but also a drunk. So, you know, the skeletons come out in this Long Day's Journey, in this very long play. It's a 3-hour play, but like someone once said, you know, if you watch it and if it's done right, it's just riveting, because it's family secrets. A lot of great American drama is about the family and about all the little skeletons we have and all the you know, ideals that we want, but that are dashed against the rocks of reality. So it's just a wonderful, human, gritty, moving piece. And the group theater is an important part of the growth of American drama, because Stella Adler was part of the group, and Lee Strasberg and Sanford Meisner. And Stella actually went over to Russia and studied Stanislavski technique and brought that back to America. And these were some young theater artists camping out like in Cape Cod in the summer. This was in the early 30s, and talking about this new style of acting. And so out of that, for about a 10-year period, there were some very famous directors and playwrights that came out of that, doing these new kind of theater, these new kind of gritty, wonderful dramas, realistic characters, realistic acting, getting away from some of the more mannered acting that was kind of the style that you see in like if you see like something with a 30s film that, oh, I said everybody kind of talks in that quasi British accent, and they're all very that kind of thing. So this is grittier, just more honest, you know, working on the emotion. Also important is the emergence of the female voice, which has always been there, but really been subsumed and not as strong. We have Lillian Hellman, who is the first major American woman playwright. She was married to Dashiell Hammett, who you may, if you're a crime aficionado, he was a major crime story writer, along with Raymond Chandler, you know, that whole era. But Lillian Hellman, like many great dramatists, was a social realist and dealt with society. Two of her most famous plays are The Children's Hour, which is about a scandal brought on by a teacher who was mistakenly accused by one of her bratty little students that she was like a lesbian. You know, that she was, you know, living with this woman, and they were friends, and they might have been living together, but they were not. It was not sexual. This was like the 30s, and but again, it was a big scandal. So basically what's brought on by innuendo and gossip. And then The Little Foxes was another was a play about a family in the South. Again, they were corporate, and there's corporate greed and stuff like that. You know, if you watch Succession or Billions or any of these shows nowadays about this, you know, that seems kind of old hat. But it's also strong writing, because this goes back to Ibsen, you know, the enemy of the people. Same kind of thing, looking at corruption and greed, which is so endemic in a capitalistic society. I mean, we have a wonderful society that we're living in, but too often, the people in charge just get tempted by greed, and you know, and it's sad. We could have such a better world if people would just, you know, say, okay, I'm making enough money, let's be reasonable and share it with somebody else too. Tennessee Williams was another major playwright of the 50s. Again, considered a poetic realist, a realistic play, but a very realistic playwright, a realistic dialogue. But he had flashes of fantasy and playing styles within that too. His most famous play was Streetcar Named Desire. I think we saw a clip of that earlier when we looked at acting. A lot of his plays dealt with this tension between this yearning to be fragile and beautiful, and all this you know, spiritual, this part of us that's yearning for this higher consciousness, versus this earthy, realistic, sexual, food, sex, these base impulses that we have. So this yin yang that we have within ourselves, that really Williams really dramatized in many of his great plays. And the other thing about Williams is that his plays were very popular. So not only was he a critical darling, but his plays brought people to the show, because there was a sexuality about them, there was a vividness about them, and there was the poetry. So he touched a lot of bases. And then most people have probably, you know, been familiar with Death of a Salesman in the course of their studies. A lot of times it's recommended reading in high school. Again, Miller was directly influenced by Ibsen. Death of a Salesman, about an indictment of society. The Crucible, again, is about gossip and gang, you know, mentality that echoes back to Lillian Hellman. And The Children's Hour, about how scandal and stuff malicious gossip and things can start. Strong American plays. And I think I have a clip of Death of a Salesman in your supplementary material too, to take a look at. And also African-American theater, the rise. And African-American theater had been present in the American consciousness. There was a repertory company in the 1800s that got started. There was African-Americans, but they didn't have much success here. They went over to Europe and did more work there. African American theater was coming. There were musicals and done in the early 1900s. But Lorraine Hansberry was important because first, not only she was a major female playwright, but she was African American, and the first African American play that was a success on Broadway. So punched a lot of boxes here. And Raisin in the Sun will be part of your. I will put that on your playlist to take a look at too. It has a power. It was written, it was written in '60s, so it's 80 years old now. But if you see it, it's so relevant today. The issues that she's talking about are still powerful and relevant. But it's also a heartwarming play because it's about the power of the family. Again, goes back to all these plays the American playwrights write about the power of the family. And then we have the whole other aspect. Okay, let's rewind here and go back. We have departures from realism. So we have non-realism too. So this in modern theater, you have two basic strains. This whole strain about people trying to get away from that. Strindberg was another European playwright. He was Swedish playwright, August Strindberg. And he wrote both realistic and non-realistic. Dream play was basically how would you dramatize a dream. And so that's kind of what, when you think of all the disconnected thoughts, and so people randomly coming in from here and everything, and then look at the films like Where Dreams May Come and Inception, plays that work with this dream world. We have a lot of that in film because film can do that so wonderfully. They can just do the ooey-oo stuff and then bring people in and out. Also, remember I talked about Calderón de la Barca in the 1600s in Spain. Life is a Dream again. So really, he's started touching on that then. Strindberg fills that out more. But he also Strindberg did realistic plays too. Miss Julie, about a servant master, tete-a-tete with a female aristocratic young woman and her servant. And there's obviously sexual and power games played out in that. Then Luigi Pirandello deals with what is real, what is not. One of his most famous plays is Six Characters in Search of an Author, where basically you have people rehearsing a play, and then the actors that are the characters of the play come on the stage and say, hey, you're not doing it right. Or, there's this interaction between the fictional characters and the people playing the characters, and just, it just mixes in. So just people trying to do different things in that world. This is all the early 1900s. The high point really is probably in the 20s. There was a lot of creative things happening in that era. A lot of it in Paris. Paris in the 20s. Think the cafes and the writers and the artists and the novelists all coming there. Gertrude Stein was there. Hemingway was there, and Picasso. This is actually a portrait of Gertrude Stein, but Picasso really, and this is a really good way to visually look at the difference between what is expressionism. This is realism. This is somebody's real. This is the real person, and to express it, what's their most innermost feelings. So what is it like on the inside? It's like if you rip the mask off of someone's face, what are they like inside? And look at how much expression you can get in this painting, all the emotion and the tears and the anguish coming out. It's like you've just ripped their face off, and you can see all the, anguish underneath. So Cabinet of Dr. Caligari was an early German film that was expressionistic. It had this kind of weird, again, a weird kind of world. Some of the movies of Fritz Lang are very, very expressionistic and wonderful. You have Dali, Salvador Dali is an artist, the dripping clock, and the world where the landscape is just, everything's mobile. So we had a lot of isms, futurism, people confronting the audience, You know, that goes back to Meyerhold, that when we talked about directors wanting to just, let's take away the curtains and just do theater. Surrealism, just strange stuff. None of this stuff was, necessarily a big commercial success, but it was still part of the expression. People were trying to find different ways to create their art. And then in the world of theater tech, now with the presence of electricity, again, I remember I said the modern era really starts from about 1880, and this is the time when you start, where the electricity has been created and you have electricity, the light bulb. So now you can use that in theater. You don't have the gas lights, you're not burning down theaters. But you can realize that you can use light as a physical being. I think I had a clip earlier from the scene design where Joseph Svoboda created these circles, these big columns out of light, and like by illuminating areas. And actually, this may be considered new, but it's also, it kind of goes back to the old Greek model. In ancient Greece, is kind of very simplicity, and this kind of thing is very, very reminiscent of early Asper type of expressionistic look. It's kind of like the Lion King here a little bit. And then you have Adolf Appia, a Swiss designer, creating the black box, which we looked at in theater spaces, the open space where you can do anything. This was Meyerhold. Yes, Meyerhold, using this theatricality in non-realistic way. Let's make it like the Peking opera, the Beijing opera, this very physical kind of circus style, big mechanical thing. And Erwin Piscator in Germany, using multimedia, which we use all the time now. Now we always have slide projections. Theater nowadays, we're just doing, virtual projections, because it's so much, you can do so much more with it. You can have moving images. You don't need a physical set anymore. But Piscator was using multimedia theater in Germany in the 30s. This is a floor plan of this black thing is the playing space, and he's got the audience rotating around on a series of revolves, and then projections up on the side, that you look at these projections while the audience is rotating around. So these crazy ideas coming out of this whole really vibrant period. And then in France, you have Artaud, who's a theorist, and his theater, and he was very influential as a theatrical philosopher. And if you're a theater major in college, you get this his book about the theater of cruelty, and his idea, not whips and lashes, but just to bombard your senses, just in a very primitive, primal way. He wants to confront the audience, like if you have a rock concert and you close the doors and you can't let people out, and you boom, 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 rhythms, primal rhythms, and trying to get maybe from really articulate, literate theater, but really more primitive, primal, and a very influential theorist, and had some look as a director and also as an actor. This was him as an actor, striking young man. You can see he had movie star good looks, and then basically ended his life in an asylum. He was crazy and just kind of wasted out, but an important theater philosopher. And then in Germany, you've got Brecht. Remember I talked about the Berliner Ensemble, again, using Meyerhold's ideas of putting up placards. We are in a theater, this is happening, here's the love scene, this is the scene where they lose the house, that kind of thing. Very presentational, trying to get people away from their comfort zones by alienating them. He saw theater as a teaching experience, like the Greeks. They saw the plays like Oedipus and Medea as learning. Don't be like this. So he wanted to teach people. He wanted to alienate people, not turn them away from the theater, but separate them from the experience, so they wouldn't just get sucked into the world of theater, but they would look at it objectively outside of that. And used historification, which is like bringing in, if you're doing like the Revolutionary War, bringing in things like a cell phone or a revolver that just breaks up the period, to make a comment about these things are timeless. They happen at every period. So all kinds of really crazy things going on. And then finally, in the realm of absurdism, we get the theater of the absurd and Beckett's Waiting for Godot, which we looked at Waiting for Godot when we looked at acting. This kind of bombed out Mad Max type of world after World War II, where people go, is there a God? What is there? The world is irrational. We just exist. You know, there is nothing else. So this kind of very stripped down type of theater, minimal words, a collision of words. They may make sense, they may not. Poetry, but this is again the guy, the spare world, trying to dramatize the craziness of the world. How do you do that? So Beckett was influential too for another era of the 60s revolution, and from the 60s, and really trying to go that way. So I think that would be a good place. Yeah, that's a good place to stop with this particular lecture, and the last one will be the 60s on, and we'll also look at musical theater too in the very final slide presentation. Okay, we'll see you then.